Hi there. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Sip Sip Hooray, the podcast for people thirsty for information and fun stories about the world of wine. On the podcast today, one of the OG wine bloggers and the wine industry's favorite muckraker, a man who is not afraid to call out an industry that doesn't always play fair, or the forces he feels are working against the American wine consumer. Tom Wark speaks for us, the wine lovers and little guys, and he's not afraid to push back against the big dogs or the accepted norms in the wine industry. But at the core of Tom's work, both in media and public relations and as a blogger, is his love of wine, vineyards, the growers, winemakers, and other fine people in an often imperfect industry. We're eager to find out what's on Tom's mind today, from declining wine sales to ominous new health warnings about wine and his peek into the future of the industry. Tom has thoughts, and he's not afraid to share them, and for that we are so glad. We are the two Marys who like to eat, drink, and be merry. I'm Mary Babbitt.
I'm Mary Orland. Tom Wark has been writing about wine and the wine industry for 35 years. He launched Fermentation, which was in a blog form back in 2004, because he said then everyone needed to know what he was thinking. He co-founded the Wine Bloggers Conference, which is I met Tom years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. He was also one of the first wine communicators to move to Substack, where he now publishes Fermentation as a newsletter several times a week. You can subscribe to it. There's a free and a paid version. Fermentation is a must-read in the wine industry because everyone wants to know what Tom Wark thinks, but it's also a heck of a good read for anyone who loves wine and wants to know what's happening on important issues such as DTC shipping, access to wine, regulations, litigations, changes in consumer demand, and more. Here to give us his opinions, commentary, perspective, and wisdom, Tom, welcome to Sip Sip Hooray.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Boy, thank you for that introduction, too. I can't wait to see what I have to say.
We can't either.
I love that. Well, I think before we get into, your hot topics, let's get a little bit of background on you, Tom. Let's help our listeners learn a little bit more about you, how you got into the wine industry, both in public relations, and then what drove you to start writing about wine.
Sure. So I grew up in Northern California, just north of San Francisco, and my family were not wine drinkers. My mom would always keep a jug of Sebastiani on the top shelf of the pantry. She would occasionally use it in cooking, but not very often. So wine wasn't something that was necessarily in my family. But for whatever reason, I got interested in wine fairly young because, believe it or not, before I was 21, I actually drank a little bit. And so did my friends. But they were drinking these beers that I thought were just too bitter, right? And then they wanted to feed me rum and Coke, and that was too sweet. I remember having wine and thinking, well, this is pretty good. I like this. So I started to investigate wine. So I started going up to Napa Valley, which was about 45 minutes away from where I lived when I was about 18 years old. I never got started. But at that time, this is, I guess, in the 80s, there were about, 10, 15, 20 different tasting rooms where you could walk into, zero tasting fees. You'd walk up to the bar, they'd give you 4 or 5 drinks, they'd say thank you, and you'd move on.
I remember those days too. I mean, it was crazy. It was so fun. When I was young, that was like a really good time, like to go with friends.
Well, honestly, I never told my friends that I went because I don't know what they would have said about me. You want to go wine tasting? I would say to my 9-year-old friends, no, we don't want to do that, Tom. But it was a fun time up in Napa Valley and Sonoma for that matter. So that was my original interest in wine. But when I went to school, the plan was to become an academic. And so I went to Humboldt State, got my BA in history, and I went to San Francisco State with the intent of getting a postgraduate degree in teaching. But my last year of my master's in history, I ended up doing some lecturing in intro history classes and then grading papers. And I remember grading these papers where there would be entire paragraphs with no verbs in them. And then I had this thought about grading these kinds of papers for 30 years. And
Oh no.
I couldn't bring myself to do it, right? So I had to
Nightmare.
get a job at the time. And so I assessed my skills and the things I liked, and it looked like marketing might be something good for me. Then it looked like, oh, okay, within marketing, there's this public relations thing. And then I realized, oh, there's different kinds of public relations. There's high tech PR, there's literary PR, and there's wine PR too. So I started looking around, and a guy named Jerry Mead, who himself was an old muckraker, directed me at a PR firm and said, you got to talk to this person. And so I did, and I got a job working in PR, in wine PR. As a wine PR firm up in Santa Rosa called Graceland Associates. And I did that for 3 years before I finally did the math. The math was how much am I getting paid versus how much of the clients that I'm servicing are paying the firm.
Uh-huh.
And that's when I
Mm.
decided I should become an independent consultant, which I did
Mhm.
around 1994, I think. And so ever since then, I've been providing public relations and marketing and writing services for wineries and retailers and trade associations, media, media companies in some cases, and it's been a good career. And so I've had work communications now for since 1994.
So
How has
Tom,
it changed over time? What do clients need now that they didn't 30 years ago?
Well, there are some technical things that have obviously changed. When I first got into the business, there was no such thing as social media, for example, and that's a big important part of the job now is managing social media, strategizing about social media. But the heart of the job is the same, and that is to help my clients tell their story in hopefully a creative way so that other people will want to write about our clients or tell our clients stories. A variety of things have changed though. So for when I first started out, for example, if I wanted to talk to you, Mary, and if I wanted to pitch you a story about one of my clients, I would pick up the phone and I would call you
Mhm.
out of the blue. I wouldn't text you and say, do you have a second? I wouldn't email you and say, do you have a second? I would simply pick up the phone. And I just saw a survey that said 50% of the respondents said, no, you should not call me before you text me and let me know you're going to do it.
oh yes, I saw that too.
Isn't that fascinating?
It
I thought,
is.
wow. Anyway, a lot of things have changed, but the core of the job is still the same, and that is to help our clients communicate their best attributes to the various constituencies that need to hear it, be it consumers or the trade or the regulatory community. So that's what I've been doing now for the last, I guess, 30 years.
So Tom, what is it about the three-tier system, shipping issues, regulatory issues in the wine industry, all of these things that are kind of not the glamorous side of wine per se, but what was it about these issues that made you want to write and start a blog and start fermentation?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not naturally quixotic, but back in 1991, I think it was, I started working. One of my clients was Matanzas Creek Winery.
Oh,
And
yes.
at Matanzas Creek Winery was a guy named Bill McKeever. Um, he was one of the owners along with his wife, Sandra McKeever. And Bill, in fact, did have a penchant for quixotic battles and for standing up for the little guy. And I was one of the guys who one of my jobs was to edit either his letters to the editor or letters to magazines or letters to colleagues or letters to people that he thought were doing wrong for the little guy. And I started to read a lot of what Bill had to say and understand his thinking. Bill was one of the people who led the exodus away from the Wine Institute because the Wine Institute wasn't focusing on direct consumer issues and wasn't focusing on the pushback against neo-prohibitionism in the early 90s. And he started this new organization called Family of Winemakers of California. And he helped start another organization called Aware, which was sort of a pushback against the anti-alcohol talk at the time. And he really had a big influence on me. He's a very, very good man. Grew up in West Texas as a sharecropper. His family did. And he married up in the form of Sandra McKeever, who was one of the heirs to the Sears and Roebuck fortune. And I had the good fortune of being able to work for them. But it was through Bill, really, that I was inculcated into this sort of cult of the little guy. And it became clear once I started to look at things that the system itself was arrayed against small wineries and small retailers. And that was in the form of the strict three-tier system, which we can talk about if we have to. And it was in the form of bans against shipping directly to consumer. And so I slowly got thinking about it more and more, and I started to get a bit incensed in the same way that Bill did. And there wasn't much that I could do about it at the time. But then around 2002, 2003, 2004, new software emerged that allowed for blogging. Prior to this, blogging software, it was very, very difficult to create an avenue to express yourself. But with the new blogging software, it became very easy to quickly publish and to do so inexpensively. And I liked the sound of that. And I always believed that people needed to know exactly what I thought. And so I started blogging in 2004 when there were, I don't know, two or three other bloggers. And I found that I naturally wrote more passionately about these sort of industry issues. And I cultivated a readership around those issues.
Well,
So,
one of the things I've always loved about fermentation and the blog form and now on Substack are reading the comments.
yeah.
You really have great interactivity with your readers, and some of them are very thoughtful, some are controversial, but I think that really makes your writing come more alive.
I agree 100%. Some of them are downright mean, though.
That's true.
But I don't mind, right? I don't care if somebody disagrees with me. I don't care if they disagree with me using four-letter words, and I don't care if they call me names. I just don't care. The fact that they thought enough to write and to contribute, such as it was, or such as it is, that's really what animates me, right? And it often results in me thinking about things in a different way, a lot of these comments. So the comments are very motivational for me. So I'm glad that I've been able to sort of cultivate a commentariat, if you will, over the years.
Well, it takes courage to do that because, a lot of people shy away from the first negative thing said about them and just think, oh dear, I better, I better not stick my neck out there again. But you have certainly not been afraid to say what's on your mind. And, you mentioned you mentioned prohibition, which I think most of us think was a long time ago, and we're well past that. But what is this neo-prohibition that you speak of, and how is it going to impact wine sales, or how is it already?
So neo-prohibitionism as a term is sort of a catch-all for efforts to restrict access to and restrict the sales of alcohol. And it's come in waves. Obviously, we had a big wave of neo-prohibitionism or prohibitionism back in the early 1900s, 1900s, 1910s, and that led, in fact, to prohibition. But back in the, I'd say, late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a big push against alcohol. A lot of it was driven by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And today we see another wave of pushback against alcohol consumption, driven by a whole number of different things. And a lot of times when we have these waves of anti-alcohol sentiment, we have folks who are really trying to address overconsumption and the harm that comes from overconsumption, but they don't distinguish between responsible consumption and overconsumption. And so as a result, they start advocating for some really draconian measures to push back on alcohol consumption, restrictions in how you can market the product, restrictions on, or not restrictions on, but enhanced taxation on alcohol, hugely enhanced taxation, huge warning labels taking over the real estate of the label or the product. And so that's the sort of thing that we're seeing today. It's less to do today with drunk driving, which is really was the motivator back in the early 90s. But there seems to be a really interesting move, particularly among younger folks
Right.
today. And we see it in a lot of different ways. It's almost sort of a Victorian mindset that
Right.
has.
And what do you think is driving the younger consumers to turn away from alcohol?
Well, first of all, I would say the degree to which younger consumers are turning away from alcohol isn't necessarily as severe or systemic as we've sometimes portrayed. But there's definitely something going on. I think part of it is the economy. I think alcohol is a luxury product, and I think it can be expensive.
Yes.
And younger people today don't have the benefit of the economy that I grew up in, right? I mean, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, 2000s, and it was good, let me tell you.
Yes, same here.
Yeah.
I remember those days fondly.
No,
Well, yeah. And if you're young, you're looking for, oftentimes a young person, it might be looking for a cheap buzz rather than a fancy bottle of wine. And I think wine prices, I agree with you that that it gets too expensive if your budget is tight. You're like, how much bang do I get out of this buck?
it's funny. I call it inebriation dollars. Um, but there's some interesting things going on right now with young people. I mean, if you look at the data, well, you find that in general, younger folks are drinking less. They are smoking less. They're driving less. They're having less sex. And they're also, they're much more censorious in sort of a Victorian sort of way. And I honestly don't know what's driving this. I think it's a very complex matrix of things that's driving it. But one of the consequences of this attitude among younger folks is they're drinking less. But also, when they do drink, bringing it back to wine, they have many, many more choices than we do. As I said, when I grew up, it was beer, it was spirits, or it was wine. That was it. I mean, maybe wine coolers, right? A lot of people.
I was just going to say, don't forget the wine cooler.
Right. The bottles
Barrel
and
and
James.
James, yep.
Right. There was a lot of that being drunk. But now, I mean, God, there are so many things that didn't really exist or weren't within my eye view at the point when I was younger. I mean, you've got alcoholic kombucha,
right,
hard cider, hard seltzer, all sorts of different things. You've got these cocktails in a can too, right? RTDs, and so there's a lot more choice. And I think that's one of the things too that has made wine not necessarily less attractive, but it's a smaller piece of the pie. And I think that's something that the wine industry is going to have to learn to live with over the coming years, is that they are going to be a smaller piece of the pie. But I do suspect though that as Gen Z ages, and I mean, I'm more worried about the millennials now than Gen Z. Those are they're young. But it's the younger millennials right now, I think, who will determine the trajectory of the wine industry in the United States, how they adapt when they take my job and start making some money.
Well, what are you telling wineries these days and your wine friends? What is, I know you don't have a magic looking glass or crystal ball or whatever, but do you have any thoughts or advice on what the industry ought to be doing to respond to the changes?
Well, it depends on the winery itself, right? So if I have a client who's making $300 bottle wines and they're making 500 cases a year, and if they're selling it all out, they probably don't need me. But my advice would be probably keep doing what you're doing. You're gonna end up selling your wine to 50-plus-year-old white guys for the foreseeable future. That's going to broaden out. There's going to be a few more rich Hispanic guys and a few more rich Black guys who buy your wine, but your market's pretty narrow no matter what. But one thing we do know is that the experience of being near the production of wine and the growing of wine is so much more important to younger generations than it was to my generation when we were just starting out. And so some of the advice that I'm giving to my clients who deal in the hospitality side of the wine industry is to try to make an accessible experience that is memorable in a way that's different from your neighbor, that can be talked about, that can be Instagrammed, that can be TikToked. And that's not too difficult to do. It can be done. But that's the kind of advice that I'm giving to folks. And of course, the other thing I'm giving to folks is if you are going to dabble and deal in and commit yourself to social media, you darn well better do it right. And you better think twice about farming it out to somebody who doesn't know where the bodies are buried at your winery. Because one of the things that makes social media really, really beneficial is the way it can communicate what makes your place so unique? And obviously, what makes your place so unique are the people who are there. It's not the grapes that are in the ground. One grape is no different than the next grapevine, right? I mean, they all look the same from a
Hmm.
distance. The bottles are all the same shape from a distance, but once you get up close, it's the people who make the
Mhm.
distance
So
a
true.
difference.
Great point. Love that.
Absolutely. So, Tom, you recently wrote kind of a big warning to the wine industry that what the World Health Organization did last year in coming out with a declaration that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption may indeed be coming to the USDA dietary guidelines when they revise them in 2025. What's been the response to that, and what percentage, what chance do you give that of really coming from? I know you had a source who you got the information from, but gosh, can that really happen?
Yes, it can happen.
In a word.
So my source is inside the federal government, and they're a source that would know. And they told me that the part of the language surrounding alcohol recommendations for the coming 2025 dietary um, guidelines will be that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption. Um, this is on the one hand, it's absurd.
Right. Hmm.
It's also silly. Yet, it's also the position of the World Health Organization. It's also the position of Canada now.
Yes.
And it's the
Hmm.
position that most European countries are moving in. Um, now, whether or not the federal government recommends that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption or not, I think will depend a lot on politics. I think it will depend on the degree to which um, representatives and senators can be influential in the dietary guideline process. Now, that sounds terribly unethical to me, that they would pressure the folks writing the guidelines to push it one way or another. But you have to balance that against the unethical nature of saying that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption. This is
Good point.
terribly unethical. So I think the best hope we have is a good lobbying effort on by folks who care about this and who are in positions of power. I can say
Yes.
this, however, anyone right now listening to this can go to their computer, open up the Google machine, and type in how much alcohol can I drink, and you will get more than 1 million hits that say, well, if you're a man, 2 glasses a day, or if you're a woman, 1 glass a day, and all of that stems, all of it, from the dietary guidelines of the past 20 years, from the USDA, which yeah, that said that's how much is safe to drink. That's what moderate consumption is. Everyone who thinks about this knows that it's 2 glasses for men, 1 glass for women. So I'm wondering if the recommendation comes down that there's no safe level of alcohol consumption, how much influence will that have in 10 years? I'm not worried about me. I know what I can drink. You know what you can drink. But I'm wondering about some folks who are 20 years old or 15 years old or 25 years old. How will
Right.
that impact them? And I'm absolutely positive,
And is it
100%.
is it politically based or is it research based?
They're going to
What?
argue that it's research based.
Okay. New research?
No, no, not necessarily new research. But what worries me though is that it's going to have a tremendous impact on alcohol consumption in the United States and wine consumption too. It's going to reduce wine consumption in a way that is not organic. It's completely artificial, and it's going to do so in a way based on essentially false testimony from the federal government.
Yeah.
That bothers me a lot.
Sure. Wow. So in the same vein of kind of limits on what you can or can't drink, I'd like to move the discussion to something you've been very passionate about for years, and that's about the three-tier system and direct-to-consumer shipping or shipping interstate issues that have an impact on what types of wine or other alcoholic beverages are available to consumers.
Sure.
So I think, first of all, it would help just to give a brief explanation of the three-tier system. Many people may not realize that it came about as a result of prohibition being repealed in 1933.
That's correct. I mean, you forgive me. I studied history, so I like this stuff probably more than others. But if you go back to 1890, 1900, 1910, there was a real alcohol problem in the United States. People drank excessively. And a lot of the drinkings was revolved around taverns. Particularly in metropolitan areas, there were taverns on every corner.
Hmm.
And the reason there were taverns on every corner is it was through taverns through which alcohol was generally distributed. And the way it worked was through something called a tide house system. So either a brewer, let's take a brewer, for example, either the brewer would open up a tavern and they would only sell their own products, or the brewer would help an individual open up by giving them fixtures and loans and leases, et cetera, in exchange for them only selling their beer. And so the only way that a brewer could expand their distribution network would be to open up a new tavern. And so that's why you had taverns everywhere.
Mm.
So the tavern, say in 1910 was a pretty interesting place, and it was a fairly important place too. In 1910, first of all, there was no air conditioning. There was no radio. There was no TV. There was no streaming services. There was no Netflix. If you wanted to get the news of the day, you went to the tavern.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to get a job, you went to the tavern.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to commune with your people, you went to the tavern. If you wanted to organize politically, you went to the tavern. And so people went to the tavern. And there would often be these terrible, terrible marketing practices. If you buy 3 buckets of beer, we'll give you a free lunch, right? So you buy 3 buckets of beer. We'll stay open 24/7, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're allowed to sleep on our front porch, if you have too much.
Wow.
It caused so much harm. It broke up families. It was terrible. And it was that combined with this sort of anti-immigrant sentiment at the time, because a lot of the urban areas were at that time experiencing a second wave of immigration. It was that tavern situation, along with sort of an anti-immigrant sentiment and an anti-Catholic sentiment, that led people to support prohibition. And so prohibition hit in 1919, and it lasted through 1923. During that period, we saw a rise in organized crime, but finally, around 1932 or so, during FDR's first election, it became clear that prohibition wasn't being supported. It was going to end. And the question came to be, how would we regulate alcohol after prohibition? And the one thing everybody knew was we can't go back to this tide house system. We can't allow brewers to just open up taverns on every street and allow them to fund individuals with the guarantee they'd only sell their beer. We have to have something to prevent the tide house system. The tide house system is evil. And so what developed was something called the 3-tier system. And the entire raison d'etre of the 3-tier system is to separate the producer of alcohol from the retailer or seller of alcohol by putting in between a wholesaler. By 1936, every single state in the Union, outside of control states, nearly every single state in the Union had this system where, by law, a producer could only, say a producer in California, could only sell their wine to a wholesaler in Illinois. And it was only the wholesaler who could sell a product to a retailer. So the retailer could only get their inventory from a wholesaler. That is the 3-tier system. First tier is the producer, second tier is the wholesaler, third tier is the retailer. That system was put in place to prevent a return to the tide house system. Now, today, we don't go to the tavern to get our news. And today, we don't go to the tavern to organize politically. We don't go to the tavern to get a job. We don't go to the tavern to commune with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So oddly enough, we have a system in place today to prevent a return to something that could never be returned to.
Good point.
You mean, and full stop, that's it? There's no other reason for this?
That is the animating reason for the 3-tier system. That's why it was put in place. So, for example, because of the 3-tier system, it is illegal for a small Oregon winery to sell their wines directly to an Oregon retailer. I mean, to an Illinois retailer or a New York retailer. Now, there are numerous New York retailers who would love to have 2 cases of a small Oregon producer's Pinot Noir.
Mhm.
But the wholesaler, the middleman, the second tier in New York doesn't carry that particular producer. In fact, that producer can't get a wholesaler to carry their product because they make so little of it that it doesn't make any sense for the wholesaler to actually carry it. So it's impossible because of the laws of the three-tier system for that New York retailer to get that product.
Mhm.
The only way they can get it is through direct shipping. If the producer decides they want to direct ship to New York or to Mississippi or to Florida or to wherever. The three-tier system fundamentally restricts the market. It fundamentally restricts innovation in the alcohol industry. It fundamentally restricts what consumers can get their hands on. And that's the problem with the three-tier system, and it has to be ended.
So I was also reading that in like New York City, restaurants and bars owners, they were saying that they can't easily get New York State wines to put on their wine list because of this system.
New York is an interesting case. And in fact, New York is being sued right now. In New York, it is, in fact, a New York winery, a Finger Lakes winery, or a Long Island winery, can sell directly to a New York retailer or a New York restaurant. It's hard to do, but they can do it. However, an out-of-state winery may not sell to a New York restaurant or a New York retailer. That's a form of discrimination, in the state of New York is being sued. But the problem, I think, in New York might be that it's likely illegal that it's likely illegal that a New York winery may not use FedEx or UPS to have their wine delivered to the retailer, that they have to deliver it themselves in their own trucks. This is the case in a lot of states. Well, if you're up in the Finger Lakes district and you've got a client in New York who wants 2 cases of your wine, you have to put it on your own truck and drive it all the way into New York,
Mm.
New York City. I mean, that's
Yeah, no, thank you.
exactly, yeah, it's just not feasible, right? So there are lots of little laws like that that serve to restrict innovative practices that serve that and that essentially funnel all alcohol sales through the middle wholesaler tier. So it should not be a surprise to anybody that this wholesaler tier has become extraordinarily powerful. They dictate what's available in different markets. And one of the ways they do this is by contributing millions and millions and millions of dollars to state lawmakers. Oh, I just looked over the last 10 election cycles, wholesalers in the United States have contributed more than $200 million to
No
campaigns.
way. Well, there you go. I mean, that's always the answer. Follow the money and figure out why something's happening. So, I mean, that's a heavy lobbying group then. And so clearly they don't want to see this changed.
No, they do not. In fact, they tell me that if we change any of these laws, children are going to die.
What?
What?
Of course. I mean, if we direct ship, you don't understand. If you listen to the wholesalers, they will tell you that there's a 15-year-old just hoping for the opportunity to jump on his computer, order a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon with a stolen credit card, and then wait at the door, hope his parents aren't there when the UPS driver brings it, and then hopefully the UPS driver won't recognize that he's 15 and will accept that ID that's clearly fake, and then he's going to drink it and he's going to die. This is a story told by the wholesalers
Yeah,
every single day.
that in addition to the cost of the wine, they're willing to pay what, a $25-$30 shipping fee, right?
Exactly. And they're willing to wait, a week or so
Yeah.
to get it.
Right. That is not your quick buzz.
No, it's not.
No, it's not. But this is the story that's been, I
It
mean,
is.
I testify at a lot of hearings. And this is the story that wholesalers tell on a regular basis, right? That the wineries are just waiting, or retailers are just waiting to be able to sell online to minors.
Mhm.
But there are some cracks in the armor, aren't there? There's been a few lawsuits. There's one antitrust lawsuit right now between two of the biggest wholesalers in the country.
There's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, the wineries, I mean, way back in 2005, they sued the state of New York and the state of Michigan because Michigan allowed its own wineries to ship direct to consumers in the state, but they wouldn't allow out-of-state wineries to do the same. They sued and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, 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 no. You can't do that. You can't discriminate against out-of-state wineries like that. That violates the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And then in 2019, there was another lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court out of Tennessee, where you'll like this. In Tennessee, in order to get a retailer's license, you had to be a resident for 2 years um, before you could get the retailer's license. But in order to renew it, you had to be a resident for 10 years.
What?
I know. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that just like in the earlier lawsuit with wineries, you cannot discriminate against people who want to become retailers, and you can't discriminate against out-of-state retailers like this.
Mm-hmm.
And now there are a number of lawsuits across the country that are challenging restrictions on retailer to consumer shipping. There's about 5 of those. There's another, I think, 5 or 6 lawsuits that are challenging state laws that allow in-state wineries to sell directly to retailers, but don't let out-of-state wineries to sell directly to retailers in those states. Again, it's a matter of discrimination that's being challenged. And then also, what's really interesting is we just learned that the Federal Trade Commission they're fixing to sue Southern Glazer's Wine and Spirits wholesalers, which is the largest wholesaler in America. They are a behemoth. And they're going to sue them over the issue of Southern is giving price breaks to a certain class of retailers when they sell them wine, but not to another class. The larger chain wineries are getting lower prices on alcohol, while the smaller independent retailers are not getting those same price breaks. It turns out that there's a law that disallows that. That law hasn't been enforced in, I don't know, 25 years maybe. But the antitrust division of the Federal Trade Commission appears to be wanting to bring this suit against Southern Glazers. I don't know if they should. I don't know if it makes sense to do, but I'm happy to see them suing Southern Glazers because they are the devil.
They're the behemoth, yeah. Well, and I'm just, as you mentioned, there's a few other things in the works. So maybe we'll start to see some changes that benefit the consumer, and that would be fabulous. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, we've been reading in California and hearing in California about wineries closing up shop. And I wanted to get your opinion on what you think is behind that and what does it mean for us?
Well, every time we lose a winery, I mean, we lose part of the diversity of the industry and of the product offerings. So that's bad. Every time we see a winery close, that's jobs that are down the drain. That's bad too. I think there's a lot of wineries in California, right? So it may be a matter of oversaturation. It also may be the economy. I mean, the cost of goods has increased tremendously and across the board. So there's a matter of inflation that have impacted wineries. But my guess is the most important headwind the wineries are facing right now are higher interest rates. A lot of wineries, they finance their barrels, they finance their grapes, they pay them off later. They just do business like that. It's easy enough to do. And it's easy enough to do that when the interest rate is 2.5%. But when the interest rate is 6%, that's a significant difference.
Well, and then insurance costs for fire insurance, if they can even get it, right?
If they can even get it. Can you imagine being a winery in the hills of Napa Valley today and asking an insurance company to cover you? If you can find one who will do it, that's good news. And if they will do it, it's going to cost you 10 times it did 10 years ago.
Yes.
So it's part of the world in which we live. I think we're going to see fewer wineries over the next maybe 5 to 10 years, but it certainly won't be the end of winery expansion. I don't think the lure of wine production is going to go away. I think there will be new generations who really want to be involved in this really storied soil that exists, say, in California or the Willamette Valley or Walla Walla. Who want to be a part of that production legacy, and they'll come back and they'll find a way to make it work. Who knows? Prices go down, interest rates maybe go down, making it a little bit easier. There are headwinds right now, and there are headwinds at different times in our histories, and we will survive this. We just need to be concerned with how we're going to come out on the other end.
Sure. It seems like it's always cyclical, like any business has ups and downs, and maybe we're just on a downward trend in wine for now. And so given that, what's your outlook for the next year or so with wine? Are we going to see more consolidation, higher prices?
So yes. Consolidation doesn't concern me that much. I mean, for example, Rombauer gets bought up by, I can't remember, Gallo, I think,
Right.
bought Rombauer. Who cares, really? I mean, who cares if Gallo buys Rombauer? It's one winery. Yes, they make a big old fat buttery Chardonnay that everyone seems to like. That's fine. But
Mhm.
in the end, there's not a lot. There's not a huge number of smaller wineries that are actually being bought up. It's just that when they do get bought up, we go, ah, my favorite winery just got bought up.
That's
Um,
true.
so I'm not so worried about consolidation. I I think that we're going to see sales of wine continue to go down over the next year to 2 years.
That long. Wow.
I do. I think we, in 2024, I think we might see, I'm spitballing here, but it's just based on what I'm seeing. I think we'll see a 1.5% maybe reduction
Mhm.
in sales over 2023. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same thing the next year. A lot of it will depend again on both interest rates and inflation. I think also the rest of this year, because of the politics of 2024, I think it's just such a volatile time. It's so hard to predict what's going to happen. That bothers me a little bit, the volatility that results from politics. Um, so I'm not terribly optimistic. I don't think we're going to go off a cliff.
Hmm.
Um, but I think we need to be nimble if we're in the industry. And I think this is a great time to be a consumer, right? I mean, yes, prices are up, but there's prices will come down in certain areas and for certain wineries, and there will be deals here and there. And so if you're a wine lover and you're looking closely and you're watching if you're watching the online sites and whatnot, you can find some miraculous deals, right? I mean, and if you're into diversity
Hmm.
of wines and you want to try different things, it's never been a better time to be a wine consumer. You can find whatever you want. And as long as you can get it shipped to you, well, you're
That's
in.
another
Yeah.
whole nother issue.
Back to the conundrum. No.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, there's your bright side ish. Oh.
Hmm.
Well, gosh, Tom Wark, you are a font of interesting information about wine. And I thank you so much because everything you've shared with us, you make it interesting, easy to understand, and you keep your sense of humor about it all. And I just have really enjoyed listening to you today and learning more about all of this. I feel like we could have gone on a lot longer. So you're going to have to come back and tell us more.
Well,
That's right.
if your viewers or if your listeners liked this, they should go back and look at your catalog too, which is one of the things that I did before I came on. And I got to recommend your last interview with Miguel de Leon.
Oh, thank
Oh,
you.
I mean, I disagree with a lot of what he has to say, with most of what he has to say, but he is so articulate and he is so thoughtful and he's so great to listen to. It was just such an excellent interview. And Meg Maker too, by the way. Um,
oh, those were really fun for us as
Yeah,
well. Really delightful guests. And
exactly.
I love when I come away feeling like I learned something, or I just have so much awe and admiration for the people that we get to meet through this podcast. And it always makes me want to learn more and think, gosh, I'm not trying hard enough. I'm not reading enough.
well, put the glass down and start reading.
That's we need to do that. But I will thank you, Tom. And I also repay the compliment with recommending
Yes.
to our listeners that they go to Fermentation on Substack, they subscribe and look at your back catalog too. You've got such great articles and
Oh, yes.
it's very thought-provoking and be sure to read the comments. They are quite illuminating in many cases. But so Tom, how can our readers find you on Substack?
They can just go to Substack and do a search on fermentation wine blog, and it'll come up right there. And they can subscribe. They can get a free subscription or they can do a paid subscription. The free subscription means that you will get access to one out of every three posts. You'll get a taste of the other two posts in your email, but you won't get it all. And if you want to pay $10 a month, you can get everything, including the back catalog. And then gosh, I think there's 17 years worth of blogging over at fermentationwineblog.com, which I've left up and open to the public. So if they want to go back and see what we were talking about in 2006, they're welcome to it. It's all there too.
That's
That's
fun.
amazing.
Well, on one of your recent posts, you talked about playing more golf. And
Yes.
so I'm wondering, as we say goodbye, is that what you're up to next, or do you actually got to get back to your day job?
I wish I could play it today. I went out the other day and I shot a 75. I don't know if you know what that
Oh,
means, but
that's good. That's really good.
it was
Wow.
very exciting for me. I mean, if
Oh
I could
my
quit my
word.
job and play golf every day,
Right.
much
Hello,
as I love
doer.
this industry, I would do it. I mean, I've got a 10-year-old boy too, right? And he's getting
Right?
lessons.
Oh,
Ah,
And he likes to drive the cart and everything, and
uh-huh.
he swings so hard he falls down. It's just so much fun.
oh, I love it. I love it. Well,
Anyway,
enjoy that little guy. That's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
I
Well,
will.
Tom, again, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us, talk to our listeners. We certainly enjoyed it. You know, we'll be watching and we'll have to have you back to help explain more of what's going on in this crazy wine world.
Yeah.
It'd be
And
my
thank you for
pleasure.
being a brave voice in the wine world and speaking your mind. It's much appreciated.
Thank you both for having me. I appreciate it.
All
All
right,
right.
Tom. Well, sip, sip, hooray.
Sip,
Cheers.
sip, hooray.
I just love talking to Tom, and I am so glad he's out there fighting the good fight and trying to help the consumer and, saying, do we really need to pay this much or are these rules fair? Hooray for Tom for getting out there.
He is a major voice, and I tell you what, he's very well respected. And as he said, he's testified before Congress, he's led lobbying efforts. One thing we didn't mention was that he's also the executive director of the National Association of Wine Retailers. So he's really involved. He knows his stuff, but he's always an advocate for the wine industry in a positive way and for consumers, because ultimately, if you can't get the wines shipped, if you can't get access to the wines, it's not fair. It's just
Mm-hmm.
not fair. So he's trying to level the playing field, which I really appreciate. And for his many, many years doing this, he is tireless.
Yeah, obviously. Well, and I have to make sure we recommend his Substack newsletter, Fermentation. It is so good. It is so
Right.
well written. It's got a very easy to digest style, but he's just an excellent writer. So it's really engaging as well. And just from one fan to our friends, check it out. It's worth it.
Absolutely. We have a Substack as well, Sip Sip Hooray podcast. And one thing we do on our Substack is we recommend other Substacks, and Tom's Fermentation is one of the number one Substacks that we recommend. So you can find it there too.
Absolutely. You can also find us on social media. We are Sip Sip Hooray Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. And we encourage you, wherever you're listening to your podcast, please give us a positive rating. And on Apple Podcasts, you can give us a review, and that makes a huge difference for us. A 5-star rating would be fantastic. And if you'd take a second and write a nice review for us, that will make a world of difference to helping to grow the Sip Sip Hooray podcast.
Absolutely. Be sure to follow us on social. We are at Sip Sip Hooray Podcast on Instagram and on Facebook. We are Sip Sip Hooray, the number 1 on X. But also, if you go to our Substack, you can subscribe to our newsletter. It's free, and you will get an update once an episode drops directly to your inbox. You can also subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts so that you've got it in your podcast library to listen to anytime.
All right, Mary Orland, that's going to wrap it up for us today. I want to thank all of you for listening. And thanks, Mary, for another fun conversation with you. And cheers to you, my friend.
Cheers to you, and sip, sip, hooray.
Sip, sip, hooray.